first of all, I think that what's happening is a global phenomenon. It's not only in the Middle East. We have seen, even here in Barcelona, there were riots today, and there were riots in Greece, in London, in Pakistan, in Beijing, in Occupy Wall Street, Portland, Oregon, Mexico. So there is, I think, something global happening. It's not just it's not just a crisis in Syria. Like, it's not just a conspiracy against Bashar al-Assad. We are in the middle of a global change, and when you're in the middle of it, it's very difficult to see what it is, to understand what it is. Probably a historian will understand it in 50 years. We'll look back in 50 years and understand it. Because change, when you have changes like this, the changes take a long time. History moves very slowly. Now we think of something like the Reformation or the Renaissance or even the French Revolution or as an event, but it was a long period. Now, so I'm going to put myself in the place of a historian in 50 years and see how, and speculate about. Centuries never start on time or finish on time. I think centuries have more of a Mediterranean culture, because the 20th century really started in 1870. Most of the ideas that have taken root in the 20th century started with debates or triggered by events that happened in the 1870s. Even in the Middle East, especially in Europe, of course, a lot of this was from the 1870s. So the 20th century, if you like, started in the 1870s, and I think that what we saw last year, 2011, was the end of the 20th century. And what was very special about the 20th century was that it was for a very short time in the history of humanity. I mean, there was the idea that the state could provide everything for the individual. So there was this sort of contract between the state and the individual, where the state would give you milk when you are born, free education, would guarantee you full employment, would give you a pension when you retire, and take care of your children. And so the state took over our lives. And in return, we had to give up a lot of our freedom, a lot of our wealth, taxes, savings, inheritance, and basically we gave control of our life to politicians and to the state. Too much control, possibly. And I mean, if you look at the share of the state in GDP, for example, and at the beginning of the century, just before the First World War, it was between 8 and 13%. The share. During the 70s, which was the height of state power, it was something between 40 and 65%. 40 was in the United States, and around 55% in somewhere like the UK, and 65% in Scandinavia, and of course in Eastern Europe it was 100%. so the idea that the state could do this emerged in Western Europe after Bismarck. It was inspired by Bismarck's social insurance policies. It was basically interpreted that Bismarck's power was, Bismarck became the model after the fall of Paris in 1871. And Bismarck's power was his institutions and the scientific method that they use. So, for example, in England, the model of an English gentleman was that he's an amateur. He's never really specialist in anything. He knows everything, a little bit of everything. He studies classics, a bit of Greek, a bit of Latin. He can do drawings, he can play music, he can do sports, and he can rule India with this. So this sort of gentleman type, amateur, liberal, classical liberal education type, was seen to have failed. And the model was more the Herr Doctor who is the Prussian. It was thought that it was the German professors that were behind the army that won the war, not the army. So the German model was that of someone scientific, specialized, precise, organized. It was the exact, and this influenced a lot of the institutions in Western Europe. People started emulating it. People started moving towards that sort of ideal, and one of them was the way the social institutions of Prussia and of Germany later on. That's so. This was this together with some of the debates of the 1870s about the state, then some of the debates in the 1930s about whether you should spend money in a recession or whether you should save money. There was a big debate about this, and the people who want to spend money, the Keynesians, won the debate. And so you have all these elements came together after the Second World War, and you have 30, 40 years where the state was very powerful, where you have the welfare state, and basically you have the growth of state power, and these sort of ideas were also exported even to the Third World. Most of the Third World countries after decolonization adopted a strong state model because academics who from Europe told them that this is the model. That there is economies of scale. So that's what you have in the 20th century, and the model started going into crisis 40 years later. So it only lasted about 40 years. By the mid-80s, there was already a crisis in that system, and the state was not delivering anymore. There was inflation. People who had worked hard all their lives found that their pension was worthless when they retired because of the stagflation and the inflation, and you started having unemployment. But anyway, you have a crisis in the model, and academics and economists have been discussing it for over 20 years. I think that in 2011 it broke out in the street. Now it's become within the public domain, and you have people in the street everywhere. Not all of them are demonstrating for the same thing. Not all of them are demonstrating for or understand the problem in the same way. Some of them are mourning the state. They want the state to come back, so they are demonstrating. They want their pensions back. They want the services to become to go back to the way they were, because this is the contract. You know, I gave you everything, and some of them are taking it out on the bankers. They're saying that it's the bankers who are evil and who made the system collapse, and or that others are taking it out on immigrants or gypsies, so there is confusion. People don't know where they're going. But there is a recognition that something is definitely wrong with the system globally. The Middle East is part of that. In the Middle East, the contract was even much worse than in Western Europe or in the States or in other third world countries. The Middle East was diagnosed in, if you look up something called the Arab Human Development Report, which was published by UNDP in 2003. The diagnosis was very harsh about the Middle East, that it's the region which was the least free in the world, that it suffered from several deficits, freedom deficit, economic deficit, and women's empowerment deficit, and even cultural deficit. I mean, the Arabs are very proud of their culture, and it turns out in that report that all the books that were translated into Arabic from other foreign languages since the 9th century are the equivalent of what Greece produces in 1 year. And the whole production of all the 22 Arab countries, the MENA region, are the equivalent of the GDP of Spain. That was So the fact that the Arab world was sick was recognized before, and it broke out in 2011 in the same way as it's breaking out everywhere. People are refusing the contract. So in a way, it's the idea of the contract that has collapsed, that is no longer acceptable. It's not just fine-tuning that, we can increase taxes here or the interest rate or fine-tune. It's much more radical than that. So that's what's, in a way, what's happening. And when an idea dies, all the institutions that are based on it and all the other ideas that are associated with it also get shaken in one way or another. So that's why when Mr. Florenza was saying we have to re-examine everything, it's because everything is changed, and we don't know how, we don't know why, but we just have to re-examine all the concepts that we took for granted in the 20th century, which ended 2 months ago. So anything you believed in the end of 2010 has to be re-examined. And so in the Middle East, that contract was that you gave up everything and you got nothing. So it's not a very surprising that it happened. Now, when you have a crisis, what will happen later? I mean, how will different countries react? How will different movements react? What will happen to Islam, for example, to Islamism, which has been rising since the 1960s? There's been since the late 60s, there's been a rise of Islam. So what will happen to that? What will happen to the borders of the states? What will happen to the regimes? Who will survive? Who will not survive? And if you want, in a way, if you want a way of comparison, the Berlin Wall collapsed. Nobody knows why it collapsed. I mean, nobody knows physically how it happened. Somebody on the radio said, let's go to the wall, and suddenly the wall was no longer there. The Berlin Wall had collapsed before it fell. It was dead before it fell, because the idea of Soviet-type system had collapsed in Russia. So it was only normal that there would be an effect in the countries that followed that model in Eastern Europe. But not all the countries in Eastern Europe were affected in the same way. Not all are transformed in the same way. So, if you like, the region in the Middle East is also seeing the collapse of an idea, but different systems will react in a different way. And the questions we ask are, how do we judge what will happen will Saudi Arabia survive this? Saudi Arabia looks very stable. What's the extent? What are the criteria we have for thinking ahead about these countries? Because our concepts of what is stability and what is risk and what is viable have changed. We cannot take any longer believe what we used to believe 2 years ago, because it was misleading. If you looked at the figures for Egypt and Tunisia, they were the best countries in the region. They had the highest growth, the highest indicators, and they were the most stable, and they were the first to fall. In fact, Tunisia was the star of the region in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of all that. Now, another characteristic, if you like, of the global crisis is that this is not a peasant revolt like we've seen before, and it's not a workers' revolt. It's a middle class revolt. It's people of middle income who are more or less rebelling, and the people of middle income were the victims of the state in the 20th century, because first of all, their numbers increased with education, with welfare, and all that. You have more people who were in the middle income range, but at the same time, they are the ones who pay the highest taxes and get the least benefit from the system, and the ones that have much more to lose on that. So I'm going to. So let's start thinking how we're going to. There are two types of system. There are systems that are like this bottle, and there are systems that are like this pen. Now, this pen is very rigid, and if I put pressure on it, it doesn't bend. Yeah. This bottle, when the system is under pressure, it goes into crisis, and I can see the crisis. I can see it bending. I can see it going back. It not only does it react to pressure, it also has within it some forces that will bring it back to place. Now, if I put too much pressure on it, it could break. But I can see what's happening, and I can see that this is the pressure that it can take, and it's going to break. So this system is very different from a pencil or a pen, where if I put pressure on it, it doesn't move, and it looks stable and strong, and the more pressure I put on it, the stronger it looks. And in fact, there is a point when it will break, but 1 second before it breaks, it will look the strongest. Because I will look at it and say, but there's so much pressure on this system, and nothing is happening, so it must be very strong. And in fact, it's just about to break. But there's no way I know. It's giving me the wrong signal. And this is how the Middle East looked in the beginning of 2011. Iraq, and if you compare, say, Egypt and Iraq, if you were a banker who wanted to invest money in either Egypt or Iraq, you would look at the figures, you would say Egypt has growth, has stability, and Iraq is unstable, it's full of risk, so you'll invest in Egypt. 2 weeks later, Egypt had completely collapsed, but Iraq has still the same risk. So in a way, our concept of stability has changed because this system now is much more stable than this one. Iraq, because it could react to crisis, because it has a system where you can see the crisis, you can build the risk into, you can see the risk, you can build the risk into your calculations. Whereas in a place like Egypt, you couldn't see it, and you went in and you got basically you made the wrong decision and the wrong assessment. So if we look at the region now, at the Middle East, the countries of the Middle East, from Morocco till Yemen, or which countries will survive this? Which systems will survive? Which systems have built in them some mechanism that they can adjust to the crisis, and which ones will break? I think this is the criteria that we should use for judging the future. So a country which has a political system where there is some politics, where you can have a political crisis, where you can have a change in government through elections or through a political process in a way, is much more stable than a country which does not have which doesn't show that. So, for example, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia now looks like the most stable country in the region. And there is absolutely no signal of any crisis happening in Saudi Arabia. Whereas Bahrain is in turmoil. There's huge turmoil in Bahrain. Now, it is very possible that Bahrain is a bottle and Saudi Arabia is a pencil. And that Saudi Arabia will never show any crisis because there is no mechanism within Saudi Arabia to have a crisis or to deal with a crisis. So it will just break and collapse. So that's how I think we should look at the systems. The systems that have possibility of adjusting or going to crisis have a better chance of survival than the ones that are rigid. So the two most stable countries in the region are Iraq and Lebanon after the Arab Spring. Before the Arab Spring, Iraq and Lebanon were the two most unstable countries, and the others looked very, very stable on that. Now, the other question I want to ask is how far how do you define the region? Can we define the region like the World Bank does, which is the Middle East and North Africa, starting from Morocco, the whole of North Africa, the Levant, and then the Gulf countries to Oman, or like the Europeans do in Barcelona, which is the Mediterranean countries are separate from the others. And looking at previous patterns of change, we get mixed signals. First of all, the Middle East and North Africa region can be divided into three different distinctive regions. One is North Africa, which is closer to Europe and which has the bulk of its trade and interactions and immigration and all that with Europe, with Western Europe. Second is, so the main drivers there is the relationship with Europe. Second is the Levant, which is, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine and Israel. And this region is much more influenced by the dynamics of the region are much more sensitive to the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's how it is. And the third region, the third division, is the Gulf countries, which are really part of Asia. They dance at they dance to the tune of Asia in the sense that demographically, most of the population in the Gulf is Asian, and the economy is more part of the subcontinent than it is part of, say, the rest of the Arab world. There's much more relations with the subcontinent than with the rest of the Arab world. But so while we can divide it like this, but also the change in the region historically has happened in a much wider context. So if we look at previous periods of change, after the First World War, when the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there was the rise of a kind of westernized elite that ruled the whole region. So Atatürk was in Turkey was the extreme case. Atatürk, and during the First World War, after the First World War, transformed Turkey. He changed the language. He changed the way the script, the clothes, the constitution. He adopted a kind of Western secular model with all its components and forced it on the population. But the mood in the region was also in tune with that. And if you go to Cairo in the 1930s or to Damascus or Baghdad or any of the Arab capitals, you will also see that the elite, the ruling elite, then were more or less trying to do the same thing as Turkey with different variations. They were westernized. They were trying to build opera houses. They were trying to have a liberal constitution. They were trying to become West European in one way or another. And the geographical extent of this sort of transformation goes all the way to Afghanistan, because it wasn't just the Arab world, the former Ottoman Empire, that adopted the ideas or variations of the ideas of Atatürk. The Shah of Iran at the time also adopted these ideas. So the Shah of Iran tried to do the same thing in Iran. The same thing happened in Afghanistan. The king also took adopted the same model and tried to transform society in a way. So the change after the First World War, if you want to look at the borders of the change in ideas, it goes all the way to Afghanistan when it happens. The same thing happened in the 1950s and 60s when you started having military coups in the region. After the creation of Israel, those regimes that were liberal, pro-Western, and democratic and all that were seen to have completely failed and not able to prevent the crisis. So after the collapse of, after the creation of Israel and the loss of Palestine, if you like, there started a series of military coups in the region, and these regimes started collapsing in the same way as we are seeing now. There was a sort of a regional change. And the regional change was, the first one was Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and the model was free officers, colonels, and all that. They take over, and they create, they declare communique number one, they take over the radio station, and they declare communique number one. And you have a model which is socialist, which is authoritarian, which is pro-Soviet instead of being pro-Western. It's a complete change of mood. And if we look at how far the spectrum of this change happened, it also reached Afghanistan, Iran, the mentality. And after 1967, the Six-Day War, where Abdel Nasser was defeated, but also it was seen as a complete defeat for that model. After 1967, you start having the rise of Islamism in the region. If you look at the street in Cairo in the 1970s, there was hardly any women wearing hijab on that. But if you look in the 1980s, 90s, you see that by the turn of the century, you find hardly any woman not wearing the hijab. So you have the rise of Islam as a movement. And also, when you look at the geographic boundaries of this change, we also see that it reaches as far as Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, on that. So now the Arab Spring, we are just at the beginning of it, and it's not unrealistic to think that it will go beyond what we traditionally think of as the Arab world, which is so places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and all that will definitely be affected by it. They cannot remain unchanged. But it's not unrealistic to think that this change of mood and this change of ideas will also affect Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran and other areas. Now, so this is basically what I wanted to throw at you as the framework to judge the region, and from that we will have to think, and I will leave this to the questions. Yeah, we have to think of places. What's happening in Syria? What will happen what's the position of the Palestine question now? Is it changed? Is it true that the region is becoming Islamic, or is it the end of Islam? These are all questions that one has to look. It's all guesswork because there's no way you can know for sure. But you need a framework to analyze this, and this is what I was trying to put forward. So just a different way of thinking on it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.